Hello. Okay, it's working. I am going to try to read this entire Gossamer book. It's a chapter book. It shouldn't be that long, but long enough that I'm going to be here for a couple of hours. So I'm going to read this, and hopefully some people stop by. If not, whatever. I'll be reading to myself. So I'm going to start in a bit. I'm going to see if anybody shows up first. But yep. So I read this book when I was in like 4th grade for a book discussion at the library. To be honest, I did not understand any of it. It was a little too hard for me at the time. I was not a very good reader. So I'm basically reading this again almost for the first time because I don't remember that much from it. So I'm going to start Gossamer by Lois Lowry. For Nadine, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life, is rounded with a sleep. William Shakespeare, The Tempest, Act 4, Scene 1. Chapter 1. An owl called, its shuddering hoots repeating mournfully in the distance. Somewhere nearby, heavy wings swooped, and a young rabbit, captured by sharp talons, shrieked as he was lifted to his doom. Startled, a raccoon looked up with bright eyes from the place where he was foraging. 2 deer moved in tandem through a meadow. A thin cloud slid across the moon. The pair crept stealthily through the small house. Night was their time of work, the time when human conversations had ceased, when thoughts had drifted away, and even breathing and heartbeats had slowed. The outdoors was awake and stirring, but the little house was dark and silent. They tiptoed and whispered. Unaware, the woman and her dog slept soundly, though the dog, on his pillow bed of cedar shavings at the foot of the woman's four-poster, moved his legs now and then as if chasing a dream rabbit. "Are we a kind of dog?" littlest one asked suddenly. "Shh." They crept to their bedroom, out into the dark hall. "May I talk now?" "Oh, all right. Very quietly, though." "I asked if we are a kind of dog." Littlest one, whose name was sometimes shortened affectionately to simply Littlest, was working on this night with Fastidious, the one who had been designated teacher. Littlest was very small, new to the work, energetic and curious. Fastidious was tired, impatient, and had a headache. She sniffed in exasperation. "Whatever makes you ask such a thing? The other learners never ask questions like that." "That's because they don't take time to think about things. I'm a thinker. Right now, I'm thinking about whether I am a kind of dog." "You just tiptoed past one. What did you notice about him?" Littlest one thought. A silent snore, a whiff of doggy breath, and his upper lip was folded under by mistake, just above a big tooth. It gave him an odd expression. "Does he resemble us in the least?" Littlest pondered. "No, but I believe there are many kinds of dogs. We saw that book, remember?" "Hurry along," Fastidious said. "There's much to do, and we have to go down the stairs yet." Littlest one hurried along. The stairs were difficult, and she had to concentrate. "You do remember the book, don't you?" "Ouch!" She stumbled a little bit. "Grasp the carpet fibers. Now, look how I'm doing it." "Couldn't we flutter down?" "We can't waste our flutters. They use up energy." They both made their way down carefully. "I hear there are houses that have no stairs," Fastidious murmured in an irritated tone. "None at all. I sometimes wish I had not been assigned this particular house." Littlest looked around when they reached the bottom of the stairs. They could see now into the large room with the very colorful rug. The small paned windows were outlined in moonlight on the floor by the rug's edge. "I think this house is lovely," she said. "I wouldn't want any other house." They tiptoed across. Littlest noticed her own shadow in the moonlight. "My goodness," she exclaimed. "I didn't know we had shadows." "Of course we do. All creatures have shadows. They are a phenomenon created by light." A phenomenon created by light. What a fine phrase, Littlest thought. She twirled suddenly on the rug and watched her shadow dance. "Why is your shadow darker than mine?" she asked Fastidious, noticing the difference just then. Well, I'm thicker than you. You're barely formed yet. You're practically transparent." "Oh." Littlest examined her own self and saw that it was true. She had not paid much attention before to her own parts. Now she touched her ears, watching the shadow's arms move too. Then she swiveled her neck to peer down at her own tiny behind. "I do not have a tail," she announced. "I think I am not a dog. We are not a kind of dog." "There, you have answered your own question. Come more quickly, please. You're dawdling." Reluctantly, Littlest scurried across the design of the carpet, beyond the moonlight rectangles, and onto the pine-boarded floor, which was always a little dangerous because of splinters. What if the dog awoke? Would he see us? Or smell us, perhaps? I know he has a very significant nose. And if he did see us, or smell us, would that be dangerous for us? Or the woman? She woke the other night, remember? Because there was a bat in the house? It swooped and woke her somehow. She didn't like the bat. She was quite brave, I remember, and opened a window so the bat flew out into the night, which was where he had wanted to be all along, doing his night food finding. But what if our little footsteps and flutterings had woken her? Would she have seen us? Are we visible to her? I know we don't fly the way bats do, but we operate at night. Might we be a type of bat? Fastidious turned suddenly with a very annoyed gesture. Enough! Hush! Stop that questioning. We have our work to do. You insisted on coming. You said you'd be quiet. My nerves are becoming frayed. I want no more questions now. None whatsoever. "All right, I promise," the littlest one said obediently. They continued on, one following the other. "Are you doing your assigned tasks?" "Yes, I touched the rug, and I'm touching the sweater now, the one she left on the chair. Gently. Do not under any circumstances press, but linger and get the feel of it into yourself." "Yes, I am. You showed me how." Littlest was running her tiny fingers carefully over the sweater's soft sleeve. Then she touched a button and let her hand linger on it. It was startling, what she had felt during the lingering. The entire history of the button came to her, and all of a sudden it had been a part of a breezy picnic on a hillside in a summer long ago, a January night more recently by the fire, and even, once, the time that a cup of tea had been spilled on the sweater. It was all there still. They moved quietly around the room, touching things. Fastidious half fluttered, half climbed to a tabletop and methodically touched framed photographs. Littlest watched in the moonlight and saw how the fingers chose and touched and felt the faces gazing out from the photographs. A man in a uniform, a baby grinning, and an elderly woman with a stern look. Forgetting her promise of no questions, Littlest asked suddenly, "Might we be human?" But Fastidious did not reply. The woman stirred slightly. Chapter 2. The woman stirred lightly in her sleep. She was dreaming. Sometimes in her dreams she recalled earlier times when she had been happier. When that occurred, her eyelids fluttered and the corners of her lips moved slightly in an upward curve. Sometimes the creaking walls of the old house disturbed her sleep, or a shudder that came loose in the wind startled her briefly awake. A few nights before, a bat had found its way into the room, making squeaking sounds as it swooped through the dark. Sometimes a mouse scampered across the floor, usually in the fall when outdoor creatures sought warmth. Occasionally, she thought that she could get a cat. Women her age often kept cats as company. But she had the dog. They were growing old together, and they were good friends to each other. The dog made her take walks and gave her someone to talk to. He was all she needed. The dog and the house, and her dreams. The tiny footsteps that crossed her bedroom each night never woke her. Chapter 3. She talks constantly, asks questions, is much too curious. Fastidious sniffed imperiously and listed her complaints. What sorts of questions does she ask? They were back inside their palace now, the gathering place of the dream givers, the place they called the heap. Littlest, exhausted, had curled into her own special corner and was asleep. but the bigger ones were meeting. Most Ancient was concerned about littlest one. Oh, the usual, Fastidious replied irritably to the question. The same things we've all wondered about. Who we are, whether we might become a dog, for heaven's sake. She asked that tonight. I should never have let her see that book about dogs, but it was on the woman's coffee table. It needed touching, and she was with me. Most Ancient smiled. She's very sweet, actually. I don't think we've ever had one quite so curious. It's appealing. And she plays. Plays? Dances about. And, well, as an example, I'd been teaching her about the delicacy of touch. Next thing I knew, she was chanting something under her breath, and when I asked her what on earth she was mumbling about, she said she'd created a tongue twister out of my instructions. A tongue twister? What was it? Most Ancient looked amused. I'd prefer not to say, Fastidious said primly. Come on, tell, he coaxed. Well, all right then, she sniffed. It was this. Flutter, flicker, and trutter, no. Flutter, tricker, no. Fastidious took a deep breath and spoke very slowly. Flutter, flicker, and trickle. Flutter, flicker, and trickle. Completely silly, if you ask me. It's a nuisance, she added. We started her too soon. Most Ancient, smiling, looked around at the others. They were all resting after the nightly task. The actual touching wasn't exhausting. It was the moving around, climbing things, fluttering, which was very difficult and energy-consuming, and remembering what to touch. Stairs were hard to navigate. It made one tired. And that didn't even take into account the most arduous and important part of the job, the bestowal. Most Ancient was a little concerned about how the littlest one would take that. It was one thing to play and giggle during the touching, but bestowal was a serious and demanding task. Perhaps Fastidious was correct, and littlest wasn't up to it yet. Others? Opinions, any of you? One of the others yawned. She'll be fine. I think she's cute, actually. Just keep an eye on her. We were all curious like that once. Maybe not quite as talkative. Most Ancient smiled. Yes, that's true. Most of us were. I know I was. Do you think you can bear with it a little while longer, Fastidious, until she settles down a bit? Fastidious sighed. I suppose so, but I could switch you with someone else. Is there anyone who'd be willing to trade places? He looked around. Thin Elderly raised his hand. I'd rather have that house, as a matter of fact. My assigned house is very spare, very minimalist. Not much to touch. It makes it for a dull night. Most Ancient peered at him. Have you ever supervised? No, but I think I do a good job. I like little ones. And you? Most Ancient turned to the one who had raised the problem. How would you feel about switching? Fastidious shrugged. I'd be happy to have a dull night. Does the other house have stairs? Thin Elderly said no. Modern house, no stairs. Let's do it then. I have increasing trouble on the stairs. Done. Most Ancient made a note in his book. Anything else? He looked around, but most of them were asleep now. They lay sprawled in the heap, cuddled against each other. One snored slightly. One was murmuring, flutter, flitter. Well then, he went on and tucked the book away. He yawned. Another night's work well done, all of you. Sweet dreams, he added with a chuckle. It was his favorite joke. Chapter 4. This gathering, this dwelling place where they slept now heaped together, was the only one, a relatively small one of many. It was a small sub-colony of dream-givers. Every human population has countless such colonies, invisible always, of these well-organized, attentive, and hard-working creatures who move silently through the nights at their task. Their task is both simple and at the same time immensely difficult. Through touching, they gather material, memories, colors, words once spoken, hints of sense, and tiniest fragments of forgotten sound. They collect pieces of the past, a long ago, of today, of yesterday. They combine these things carefully, creating dreams. And then they insert the dreams as the humans and sometimes animals, for occasionally they give dreams to pets as well. Sleep. The act of dream insertion is called bestowal. It is very delicate. It requires absolute precision to bestow a dream, or even to decide exactly when one should be bestowed. Littlest, who was only learning, had not yet studied bestowal. She was beginning the way they all had, with the touching, the gathering of material. And she was learning, too, to dissolve. Concentrate, Fastidious had told her. Stay very still, focusing on your own form. Littlest stayed motionless and tried to concentrate on her small wisp of a self. I wish I had wings, she thought. Everything would be easier if we had wings. I could swoop and glide, and I would never tumble in the staircase because I was somebody. You are not concentrating! Fastidious's voice was exasperated. Sorry, Littlest said apologetically, opening her eyes. I was just thinking. That's the point. You're not supposed to think. Focus on your form, and it will break down and dissolve. Dutifully, Littlest tried again, carefully, not thinking, not paying attention at all to the thoughts that tried to swim into her mind, the questions about dogs or wings or all the many things she wondered about. And when she did that, focusing only on her own small form, she felt it begin to happen for the very first time. She felt the pieces of her, the very tiniest pieces. She did not know if they had a name. Begin to separate. I'm doing it, she called out gleefully. It's working. Then, of course, it ended. Littlest opened her eyes, knowing she had done it at least for a little bit, and hoping for praise from Fastidious. But Fastidious had disappeared. Where are you? Littlest called in alarm, and then she realized, oh my goodness, you've dissolved. In front of her, particle by particle, Fastidious reappeared. She had a very annoyed look. 2 things, Fastidious said. 1, do not ever call out when you are mid-dissolving. See what happened the instant you cried, I'm doing it. I stopped doing it, Littlest acknowledged, abashed. 2, never, never, never call attention to the fact that someone else has dissolved. This was only a training session, of course, but if we had been out there, Fastidious gestured towards a larger world, the human world. Well, the reason for dissolving is to become what? Invisible, Littles whispered, and we need to be invisible. Why? So that humans won't see us or know about us. And if I am dissolved out there in the human world and suddenly someone screams, she glared at Littlest and imitated her voice in a very shrill sarcasm. Oh my goodness, you've dissolved! I'm sorry, Littlest said. Fastidious sighed. She was tired and had a touch of headache. She didn't like children and was impatient with inexperience. Perhaps it was a good thing that now thin elderly would take over the training of Littlest one. Chapter 5. Now morning came. The woman rose slowly. She was wide awake. She always woke early, but her joints were stiffened by sleep, and she sat at the edge of the bed for a while, moving her ankles and knees, telling them to wake up and get going. She had a sense of humor about herself. You make me feel like the Tin Woodsman in The Wizard of Oz, she said to her left knee, rested and immobilized. I wish I could oil you. She stood, after a moment, and stretched. Her nightgown was flowered flannel, the small bouquets of sweet peas on it fading from repeated washings. She slipped her bare feet into worn blue slippers. Good morning, Toby, she said, looking down at the dog, who yawned and thumped his tail. What about some breakfast? Slowly, Toby roused and stretched, his nose to the floor while his rump rose. He watched while she put on a robe and tied the belt. Then he followed her into the hall, down the stairs through the front parlor into the kitchen, and stood patiently beside the cupboard where his food was stored. He watched while she filled a kettle with water and set it on the gas burner. He watched while she found a tea bag in the canister, took a thick brown mug from the cupboard, and dangled the tea bag into it. He watched while she dropped a slice of bread onto the toaster and turned the toaster on. Finally, she filled his bowl and set it onto the floor beside the stove. Then, when the kettle whistled, she poured some of the steaming water into the mug. Another day, the woman said, as she took her plate of buttered toast and a cup of tea to the table. She unfolded a flowered cloth napkin and placed it in her lap after she had sat down. Toby, finished now with his gulped breakfast, curled by her feet in a spot where the sun, finding its way through the small paned window of the old house, had outlined a square on the floor. "We'll take a walk after I get dressed," she told him. "How about that? It looks like a lovely morning." Toby drummed the floor with his tail. They took a walk every morning, unless the weather made it impossible. They always walked around the corner, turned left, and walked past the Methodist church. Many squirrels there on that large lawn, but Toby no longer bothered about them. Past the house of the young couple with the new baby, and across the street to the small park with a diagonal path where sometimes they stopped beside a fountain. Resting on the park bench, the women would listen to the birds and watch young parents push small children on the nearby swings as Toby sat attentively at her feet. Then they would continue on, around the next corner, and then the next, making a complete square and returning home. It was a short walk, but all that she could manage. He dozed while she ate. She continued to talk to him, though she knew he was asleep. She had no one else to talk to, no one but Toby. She had outlived many of her friends, as well as several earlier dogs. Life had become very lonely for the woman, but she was well accustomed to her solitude. She sipped her tea, sighed, and fingered a folded letter in its envelope that lay on the table. With a worried look, she thought about the way her existence was about to change. All right. I said I was going to read the whole thing, but I think I am not. We're going to read one more chapter, and then maybe one or two more chapters. I'll see. Anyway, chapter 6. Whatever became of Rotund. He used to curl near you in the daytime heap. Littlest was chattering as she set out for evening's work with her new supervisor. I remember that you and Rotund used to tell jokes to each other. He always told one that started, "A horse went into a bar." What's a bar, by the way? I never understood that joke. Then Elderly shook his head and chuckled. He did like little ones, it was true, but he could see that this curious chatterbox was going to be a handful. "Shh," he said. "Remember that we must always move quietly." "I am," Littles whispered. "Look, tiptoes." She pointed to her own transparent, delicate feet. She skipped along beside Thin Elderly. "I was just wondering about Rotund," she added. "I liked him, and I know he was a friend of yours." Thin Elderly frowned. The thought of it was painful to him. He turned menacing. He told the little one, "We'll say no more about it. He is gone." Turned menacing. Littles did not know exactly what it meant, but she knew it was very, very bad. Those who turned menacing disappeared. Well, not disappeared. They still existed, but they were no longer a part of the community of dream givers. They had gone someplace else, someplace frightening, maybe even evil. "Why do some of us turn menacing?" she whispered. They were at the entrance of the assigned house, the little house with geranium-filled window boxes and a rocker on the porch at a place where the women lived. In a minute they would enter, compressing themselves and sliding in through the space under the front door. Then Elderly reached over and took Littlest's hand. The timing of her question was unfortunate, he thought, because they were about to start their night's work, but he was responsible now for their teaching. "It happens," he told her in a low voice. "We're not certain why. Some think it's because they have touched things too deeply. You must be aware of that. During the touching, be gentle. Do not delve." "What is delve?" she whispered. He tried to think of a way to explain the unexplainable. "You've heard of touching, right?" She nodded. "You've been touching in here, correct?" He gestured toward the house they were about to enter. "Take your thumb out of your mouth." Littlest moved her thumb reluctantly. "Yes," she said. "Lots. This house is filled with the things." "Good. My last house, the one I had just traded to Fastidious, had so little. Flat, empty tabletops, a lot of glass and steel, a crystal vase with a single flower. What an impersonal feel to it. It was very unreceptive to touching." "You'll love this one," Littlest assured him. "Give me an example of something you've been touching." She concentrated on remembering her nights of gliding silently through the woman's house. "There are photographs," she said. I like those. They're in frames on tables in the parlor and one beside her bed, but I haven't been allowed to touch there yet. Too dangerous. The elderly nodded. Yes, you're a little noisy. Fastidious was wise not to let you too close yet. I'll have to be close when I bestow, Littlest pointed out. Eventually, but you're still learning. Describe touching a photograph. Well, there's one I especially like. I'll show you when we're inside. It shows a man in a uniform smiling. He has a very pleasant face. All right. And so you touch his picture how? Like this. Littlest raised one small hand and touched thin elderly very gently. She let her fingers flutter and linger, but the touch was barely perceptible. Thin elderly smiled. Good, he told her. You have a gossamer touch. Littlest looked at her own fingers and smiled proudly. Fastidious taught you well about touching. Tell me what happens when you touch the man's photograph. Littlest thought. I collect little... She paused. I can't remember what they're called. They can be called anything. I like to call them fragments, Thin elderly told her. She nodded. I collect fragments. I store them inside myself. They make me feel good. There's a fragment of a party, and the man is laughing. There's a bit of dancing, and there's a... She paused, blushing, and giggled. Shh, Thin elderly reminded her. Littlest one covered her mouth and stifled her own giggle. There's a kiss, she said. Well, a fragment of a kiss. I always like to collect that. All right, Thin elderly told her. It sounds as if you are quite good at touching and collecting, but here's what you must guard against. Always remember this. He leaned toward her and spoke very seriously. Delving means touching too deeply, pressing your hand instead of using that lovely light flickering touch that you just showed me. It sometimes happens unintentionally when dream givers become too interested in what they're touching, when they start to like it too much. Like the kiss, Littlest whispered. Possibly. Never linger and press, because everything has a menacing underside. If you begin to pick up the menacing pieces, he sighed. Even by mistake? Littlest asked. Then elderly nodded. It's what happened to Rotund. He pressed and delved. Some of us could see it was happening. We tried to warn him, but... Little sighed. Then he disappeared. Well, he had to go away. He became something else. You can't be a dream giver when you get consumed by the dark side, the menace. What did he become then? Then elderly shuddered. Promise me you won't talk about this in the heap. I won't. Cross my heart. Littlest touched her own pale wisp of a chest. The term is... He lowered his voice and whispered the word. Sinisteed. Don't ever say it out loud. She looked puzzled. Steed means horse, doesn't it? I touched a picture of a beautiful horse in the women's house. It's horse-like, he acknowledged. 4 legs, quite powerful. It stamps the earth and nostrils quiver. That's what Rotund is now, and others. And there's no beauty to it, he added. It's hideous. Littlest trembled a little. Can it bestow? She asked. Thin elderly gave a scornful laugh. We bestow dreams, he reminded her. But, again his voice dropped to a whisper. Sinisteed? He pondered for a moment. Then he said, it inflicts. It inflicts? Inflicts something called nightmares. They remained silent for a moment. Littlest, glancing sideways to be certain he wasn't looking, slid her thumb into her mouth again. Finally, he sighed. Better get going. We have work to do. Mustn't delay. Fastidious told me about the woman. She needs a dream, and I haven't collected anything yet. He looked down at Littlest. She withdrew her thumb. I have a lot of fragments, she told him, but she never let me bestow. Well, then elderly said, time you learned, I guess. You say you have a party and a kiss? Littlest nodded. Fragments. Well, we'll give her a very brief and gentle dream, he said. I'll show you how. Then elderly took her hand. Come, he told her, and led her toward the door. Holding hands, they compressed themselves and slid in under. The night's work was beginning. So, I think I'm going to stop there. This is chapter 7 we're on, and I will see you guys next time. Meaning tomorrow, probably around 7 or 8.